right. We have a couple more people now, so we'll get started. Thank you everyone for coming to our webinar today. The Junior Economic Club is honored to have Kathleen Barron, the Senior Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs at Exelon. To those non-members who are here, the Junior Economic Club was founded in 2014 and is an entirely student-run nonprofit that introduces high school students to business and economics through member engagement events, forums, and community initiatives. The club has over 130 students, representing over 25 high schools across Chicago, as well as chapters in 9 cities across 4 countries. You can learn more about the club and admissions at junioreconomicclub.org. So Ms. Barron is the Senior Vice President of Federal Regulatory Affairs and Wholesale Market Policy for Exelon, and in that role, she oversees Exelon's management of federal regulatory policies and strategies, and is responsible for identifying and assessing key policy issues of interest to Exelon, and crafts the company's position on such issues, and develops strategies for achieving Exelon's public policy objectives. Before that, she was the Deputy General Counsel at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where she advised the Commission on all aspects of its responsibilities and represented the Commission before Congress, government agencies, and other industry groups. She was also their Associate General Counsel for Energy Markets, where she led a group of about 90 lawyers on legal and policy matters relating to electric power sales and transportation, electric system reliability, corporate regulation of public utilities, and natural gas and oil pipeline transportation. Before that, she was in the private practice with the law firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom. There, she represented utility and independent power producer clients in proceedings before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, U.S. Court of Appeals, and state utility commissions. And she received a Juris Doctor from the University of Houston Law Center and Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from American University. And with that, Ms. Barron, if you'd like to, I'll stop sharing my screen so you can begin your presentation.
All right, well, thank you, Leo, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. I hope you can start to see my screen. Hold on a second. You guys are more tech savvy than I am, so just bear with me. How about that? Can you see page 1? Excellent. All right, good morning. I'm very happy to be with all of you this morning. And I've looked over your comments in the chat. It's great to see so many of you interested in the future of sustainability and carbon-free electricity in our planet, in our country, and we'll focus a little bit on the state of Illinois and what it can do to help contribute to solving the global climate crisis. I am accustomed to talking to high school students about this issue. I have one myself. He's a junior in high school. He's not here today because he's taking the PSAT. But I also have 2 kids in college, so they're very much accustomed to listening to me talk about this stuff, and hopefully I can do so in a way that is useful to all of you as you think about this issue for yourselves, for your families, and for your careers. We'll talk a little bit about jobs and energy if you like. So I'll start with the company itself. You're all customers of Commonwealth Edison, which is one of our distribution companies. So on this page, we're showing how Exelon contributes to energy across the value stream. ComEd on the right side is one of our companies, one of our 6 companies that delivers electricity, and some of them deliver natural gas, but for ComEd, it's just electricity. It owns the wires, and it distributes and delivers electricity to your house and to your businesses that you frequent. But we also have a whole other part of the company that makes electricity at our various types of power plants: nuclear, wind, solar, natural gas, hydro. We have a biomass plant in Georgia that makes electricity out of wood chips. So we make electricity at power plants that are in 19 states across the country. And then that electricity is sold by this competitive energy cells business in the middle of the screen. That business is based in Baltimore, and it sells electricity to any customer across the country that is allowed to purchase electricity competitively. A lot of states like Illinois allow you to pick your electricity generator. You can buy the electricity itself from anybody you want. ComEd would then ship it to you over its power lines. So this is how the industry works across the country. You have companies that make power, companies that sell power, and then companies that distribute power. And we do all three. There's not very many companies in the country that do that, but we make enough electricity to serve 20 million homes and businesses. And then through our distribution companies, we distribute electricity to 10 million homes and businesses in the mid-Atlantic and in the Midwest. We have about 34,000 employees to do all of that. Obviously, a lot of them are in the field, engineering, very STEM intensive business. But then there's people like me who are lawyers or economists, or they're in finance, or they're in HR or IT, or any number of other sort of back office type of functions that make the company work. We are led as a company by a CEO, and there's 18 of us who serve on what we call our executive committee, and those are mostly CEOs of the various businesses that we run. I sit on the executive committee even though I'm not a CEO. Why do I do that? Because I'm responsible for policy at Exelon. Exelon is not like Nike or Apple or Coke. All businesses in America are regulated, but energy businesses are regulated from top to bottom. Everything we do, from how we make power to what price we're allowed to sell it at, how we distribute it, every single piece of that is regulated mostly at the federal and the state level. And so the way our company interacts with government is hugely important to how well we can do what we do, how much of an impact we can have on our customers, how well we can support our communities. Everything that we do is affected by government. And so they put me on the leadership team because it's just so integral to what we do. So I'm going to focus mostly on the generation side of the equation, the part of our business that makes the electricity every minute of every day. And next week, you're going to hear from my colleague, Melissa Washington, who's a senior leader at Commonwealth Edison, and she's going to talk more about the distribution side. And that's important because there's a lot of things that matter to you and to your families and to the ultimate jobs you're going to get that are decided by that local distribution company. But I'm going to sort of take a step back and talk about electricity supply generally and get to some of your questions about how we supply electricity and how we can make it more sustainable. But from our power generation side of the business, we are the lowest carbon generator in the United States by a factor of 5. So on the left side, we're showing a bunch of other energy companies and their carbon intensity, which means if you take all of their megawatt hours that they make every day, what percentage of those are zero carbon? And we have the greatest percentage of zero carbon. We have the lowest percentage of emitting plants, or plants that create pollution when they make electricity. On the right side, we're showing just total number of megawatt hours, how many each company on the list makes, and we make the most zero carbon generation. 1 out of every 9 megawatts, clean megawatts in the US is coming from one of our power plants. And that's not an accident. I'll just stay on that for a second. This is something that we have done over time. We have progressively shut down all of our coal plants. We have made more efficient or shut down our less efficient natural gas plants. We only run very efficient natural gas plants. But most of the plants we run do not use fossil fuels. Nuclear uses no fossil fuels, wind, solar, hydroelectricity. That's the vast majority of what we own, and that's by design. That's how we have developed our business to try to meet this moment in our national conversation about our contribution to clean energy. So big picture, the carbon dioxide issue on the planet and I assume some of you know some of this from classes you've taken or from your interest, but we emit carbon dioxide in almost everything we do in this economy. And we have been doing that through industrialization up to the present. And the way this all manifests itself is that at some point, we put so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we cause global temperature rise, and that causes all the impacts of global warming that you're aware of. But the point is, you can think about sort of the amount of carbon we can tolerate on the planet as a budget. There's only so much we can put into the atmosphere before we trigger the temperature rise. And this slide is showing you sort of how that has evolved over time. It happened very slowly initially, but in the past 15 years or so, a third of our budget has been used up. And we have only so much left before we trigger that 1.5 degree of warming, Celsius of warming. And I like to pause on this because sometimes people think, well, you know, the US has become more efficient and we have reduced our emissions from electricity, from other sources in the economy. And it's China and it's India and these other places that are really the ones that are polluting. That's sort of a message that's out there from folks who don't want the US to do much about this. And I wanted to show you just for a minute, you know, a little bit of a see now, here's where I got to figure this out, a graphic about why you should be a little bit skeptical when people are saying that the US doesn't have a big role in this. Can you all see this animation going across the screen? So this is cumulative emissions. This is since, you know, you can see the time scale on the right. You know, we're over here at 1880. As time has gone by, how many emissions each country has put into the atmosphere over that time period. So you can see in the beginning, the UK was way ahead of the rest of the world industrially, and so it was emitting more. But around the turn of the century, the US, you know, started catching up. And for basically all of the 20th century, every year, the US was emitting way more than every other country in the world. And that happened year after year after year after year after year. So when you think cumulatively, all the tons of carbon that are in the air and how much of them came from this country, yes, it is true that today in 2020, China is emitting more than us. They also have, what, how many times the number of human beings living in China? But think about it from a carbon budget perspective and how much of that budget has been used up already and how much of it has been used up already because of our country and because of you and me and because of things that we have done. So this is cumulative since 1750. The US is about twice total of what China is. So the point is, we put the stuff up there, we have an obligation to try and take it out as quickly as we can. So let's go back to the slides. The next page here, can you guys see the slides? Okay, is just showing that black line is the amount of time it took for us to fill up the atmosphere with carbon versus the colored lines are how steeply we have to reduce emissions as a planet in order to stop the most devastating effects of climate change. So it took a lot of time to get it up there, but we have to turn on a dime. And if we want to get the carbon emissions in the world to a level that it will not use up that budget by 2050, these are the kinds of steep emissions reductions that we have to make. So one thing I just want you to think about when you think about the US role is, you know, a lot of us think, well, you know, I didn't turn on the AC today, I don't have the heat on, I'm not getting in the car, I'm not getting on an airplane. Well, I'm not using carbon, like I'm not polluting right now. But if you just think about the bowl of cereal you ate this morning and the energy that it took to grow whatever natural ingredients are in that cereal, the amount of energy it took to process those ingredients into the cereal that you're eating, the amount of energy it took for the milk that you put in the cereal, so that's both agriculture and production of milk, the amount of energy it took to deliver that to the store and then for it to be delivered to your house, not to mention the refrigeration and the energy associated with keeping the milk cold. Like everything that we do, the entire economy in the United States is all built on fossil fuels. Electricity, production of goods, transportation. We have to take all of that carbon out, or almost all of it out, in order for us to reach any of these targets. And so it's very important to think about the scale of the problem when you try to solve it. So let's talk about solving it. The things we have to do, 4 big things we have to do. We have to be more efficient. So we have to use less energy in everything we do. That is mostly a technology point, but it's also a human point too, that, walk or bike instead of taking a car, take a bus instead of a car. There's a picture of a light bulb on here. Obviously, there's lots of things in your house that can be more efficient if you're intentional about it. And so use less energy, full stop. The second piece is to electrify as many things as we can. So if we stop using gas-fired cars and start using electric cars, if we start using electricity to heat the water or the air in our homes or our businesses, if we start using electricity in our ports, in our airplanes, all of these ways can take those types of activities off of fossil fuels, put them on electricity. And then obviously the main thing we got to do here is make sure that the way we make electricity is as low carbon as possible, so that the electricity being used in all of those applications is not contributing to emissions. And then for the things that you just cannot shift to electricity, you got to use lower carbon intensity fuels in them. So lower carbon intensity jet fuel, sources of other industry, freight, et cetera. But the thing I'm going to focus here is the right side, electricity supply, and how do we get as much zero carbon electricity onto the system, and how do we get off the system as much fossil or emitting generation as possible. And so that means solar, and there's all kinds of different solar. You can see solar on people's rooftops. You can see sort of what they call community solar, sort of local subscription-oriented solar farms where you can sort of buy a subscription and participate in it. Then there's big utility scale solar farms that take up acres and acres of land. Then there's all different types of wind, both onshore and offshore, less relevant in Illinois, but there's a lot of offshore wind development out here where I am on the East Coast. Hydroelectricity, all throughout the country, not as easier to increase at this point because there's only so many rivers that can be dammed, et cetera. And with climate change and drought, hydro is affected by that, no question, because there's less river flow, less capacity to make electricity from water. Nuclear energy, we're going to talk about in a minute. Big source of carbon-free electricity in the US. And then CCS means carbon capture and storage. And that refers to some technologies that are being developed that would allow a power plant to use fossil fuels in the production of electricity, but then capture the CO2 before it emits into the atmosphere, either store it in the ground or use it for some other industrial purpose. That's not all that prevalent in the US, but there's a lot of folks working on that technology because it would allow us to continue using a cheap source of fuel, the coal and natural gas that's in the ground, but not have the cost associated with emitting CO2 in the production of electricity. And then we'll talk a little bit about other ways that we can keep low carbon electricity on the system through use of storage and batteries. So this is, everything we've been talking about so far is really about the whole economy. Now we're going to just talk about the electric sector. And this picture is showing you, before we talked about the last 200-300 years, this is just the last 15 years. And looking forward out to 2050, the green represents how much of a reduction we're going to need to do in order to hit the target. So our emissions would need to reduce on the trajectory of that green bar, or that green space on the chart. The red is what we're actually projected to do given business as usual. So we are not projected at all to reach any of these targets unless we have very severe changes. And so the question is, how do you get change? Now, some of you in your comments talked about, I want to understand the role of private industry. I want to understand the role of customers, whether they're companies or families, and what can we do to change this? That's sort of the voluntary path, that people who want to change it say, oh, I don't want to buy dirty energy anymore. I only want to buy clean energy. And we'll talk a little bit about, particularly when you have a big company like Apple or Google or Microsoft that buys a ton of electricity for their data centers, saying that they're going to only buy clean energy, that's obviously very important. But the other thing that's very important is collective action or government action. And there's sometimes a debate on whether we should just sort of let people decide if they want to move towards a clean energy future, or if government should do it on behalf of all of us. And I mean, you can have your own view on that, but my perspective is that there are some things government has to do. If you had to decide whether you were going to pay for a national defense, you probably wouldn't do it. You'd say, well, somebody else will pay for it. But we need a national defense. We need things like Social Security. And so government decides that we need to have them, and all of us pay taxes, and our taxes go to that goal. This is a little different because if government were to decide, as it has in many places, and we'll talk about that. I'll move to this slide next. These are all the states that have actually said, we want to move towards clean energy. And we're going to set a standard in our state that says, in an increasing amount over time, everybody who buys electricity, meaning all those distribution companies, you have to buy an increasing amount of clean energy over time. And the way they pay for that is not through tax dollars, it's essentially through our power bills, that to the extent people are complying with that law, they're buying clean energy. It is more expensive than dirty energy, but the cost of that shows up in your power bill. So it's not a tax issue, but it is government taking action on behalf of society, and everyone pays a little bit of the cost of that. So where do we get our clean energy from in the US? This is nationwide, showing you the sources of emissions-free energy. Nuclear power by far is the biggest source in the US, about 56%. Hydroelectricity, those big dams we talked about, most of them are out west, but there are some in the Midwest and the East. That makes about 20%. Wind is about 20%, and solar is way far behind, but growing. It matters also when these sources of power make power. Nuclear runs 24/7. You put fuel in the core and it runs for 2 years without stopping. Hydro obviously runs when there is river flow. That can be better in times of high river flow. It can be worse in times of drought. Wind runs about 20% of the time, can be a little bit higher, but the wind is obviously not always blowing. And then the sun, easier to understand, obviously doesn't work at night, doesn't work when it's cloudy or there's a lot of pollution in the air. So I talked to you about this, that the states so far have been the ones taking action on government policy. There is no federal policy on reducing carbon dioxide. So the states have stepped in on their own, and they all have different types of standards. Some of them say they want 100% renewables. Some of them say they want 100% zero carbon. Some of them obviously have less than 100. Some of them, like Illinois, only has a 25% renewable portfolio standard or requirement for 25% renewable. Some of them just set an emission target and say, we're going to reduce emissions by X amount by X date. And they have other strategies for achieving that, both in the electric sector and throughout the economy. But let's talk about Illinois, because that's where all of you guys are. So our new governor committed the state to join the US Climate Alliance. And that means that he is saying Illinois is going to meet the Paris targets. He joined with about half the states that have joined the Climate Alliance, and they have said, it doesn't matter that the US has pulled out of Paris, the state is going to try to meet the target on its own. And Illinois is very close to meeting the 2025 Paris target, where with the amount of coal plant retirements that we've had, we're about 80% of the way to meeting that 2025 target. But Illinois is way ahead of a lot of states. It always has had one of the largest percentages of zero carbon electricity, and it's because of the 6 nuclear plants that we own, and they're listed down here on the bottom of the page, along with the date that they would be planned to retire. They have only a certain amount of years under their federal license, and the year here is showing when that license expires. It's also showing you, though, that while Illinois has a ton of clean energy, if you add up the renewable and the nuclear, you get to about 60% clean energy. Most of that is in the northern part of the state where you guys are. And that's because 5 of these 6 nuclear plants are in the northern part of the state, called the ComEd zone. The Ameren zone is the southern part of the state. It only has 1 of those nuclear plants, so that shows up as 18% nuclear. It's the smallest of our nuclear plants. And the rest of the southern part of the state is powered by mostly coal. There is some natural gas. But even in the ComEd zone, there are a number of very large coal plants up there, and a couple of natural gas plants as well. So Illinois is way ahead of a lot of states, but it obviously has a very long way to go. Illinois needs to add renewable energy quickly. So I mentioned that Illinois has a 25% renewable target. At this point, it has only achieved about 10% of that goal. Well, actually, it's more like 7 or 8%, but the projection is that it's only going to achieve about 10% of that goal by the date that it's supposed to, which is 2025. This chart is showing you carbon-free generation as a percentage of load. Load means demand. I don't know why we call it load, but it just means how much power do we need in the state. We call that the load. And if you compare the amount of carbon-free generation in Illinois to the amount of demand, obviously, as I mentioned, there is a lot of carbon-free generation, but since most of it is nuclear, this shows you how far back. Illinois is like 22nd in the country in terms of renewables, hasn't made enough of an investment in the renewable energy that we're going to need to get to 100% clean in the power sector. But the time of production matters. Now, we talked a little bit about the fact that nuclear is running all the time. Wind is not running all the time. Solar is not running all the time. So when you're adding new clean generation, you have to think about, is that generation going to be on the system at the time when you need it? So a lot of people don't understand this, but you guys are going to get a little snapshot into how the system actually runs here. And this is really important, so stop me if you're not tracking what I'm saying. But what we're showing you here is 2 different weeks. 1 week in April and 1 week in July. So April's on the left, July is on the right. And the black line you see there is the demand. Obviously it goes up during the day, it goes down at night, and that repeats itself through the week. April, it's mild. Not a lot of people have on the air conditioning. Most people don't have the heat on. So we're using less electricity in April, where even though the peak demand, like at the most we've ever used in the ComEd part of Illinois is about 25 gigawatts. Here, we're only about 10. And it's fluctuating, but it's not fluctuating all that much in April. You look over to July, totally different. Everybody's running their electricity. So we're using a lot more electricity, and it's more spiky in the middle of the day. Demand is going way up, and it goes down at night. So that's how much we need. And now we're going to start showing you what we actually have on the system. This is actual data. So we have about 9 gigawatts of nuclear power. It's running all the time. So in April, looks kind of great. Almost all of our demand is being met by zero carbon electricity, almost all the time. Now, obviously, the gap between where the nuclear is and where the black line is unmet demand, so we're going to need to use other kinds of power for that. And so let's talk about what other kinds of power we have on the system all the time. So we have a small amount of fossil that always is on because it has to, you can't sort of turn off a fossil plant. It needs to stay running at a small amount. So that red line that I just showed you is amount of fossil that's always on the system, and it's just there because if you turn the plant off, it takes like a long time for it to come back on. So a little bit of our demand is being met by fossil in these 2 hours, these 2 weeks that I'm showing you. So now let's look about what the wind is doing. The wind that we have in Illinois it does very well in the spring. You can see in April, it's running a lot of the time. It's running more than we need it to run. We have more electricity on the system than we need most of that week in April. And so what happens? Well, electricity needs to be consumed immediately. You can't sort of store it in April and use it in July. So for the excess we have in April, we have transmission lines that will ship it mostly to Indiana and to points east. So we'll sell that clean generation to other states because we have more than we need during that week in April. But look at July. The wind is not running in July. Wind is very, it doesn't run very well when it's hot. So we have much less wind generation during that week in July. And so all of that space, that white space between the amount of power that we have and the demand that we have, is going to be met with fossil fuels. So this is what we're doing in July. We are running fossil plants to fill that gap. And that's the thing we got to stop doing, because it's hot and now we're running fossil plants, which is contributing to the climate problem. So we need to add a bunch of new clean generation. So what does that look like? Let's look into the future. We have 2 bills that are pending in Springfield. One would sort of triple the amount of money we're spending on renewable energy, and one would double it. So the tripling is the CJC on the left. That stands for the Clean Jobs Coalition. That's a group that's pushing a big renewable expansion in Illinois by 2030. The path to 100 is pushing the doubling. And so now we're going to look at the same thing. Here's our demand in April. And we're only going to look at April because I'm trying to make a different point here. But in April, we have the nuclear, we have the other, we have the existing wind that's on the system now. And now we put the new wind that these bills would require. Now we've made a whole lot more energy. It's okay. I mean, we can sell some of that off the system. But now we're also adding a whole bunch of solar, which is the red. And we're doing something else. We're adding solar on rooftops. And that's a very popular thing in the United States. There's a lot of programs that fund rebates and tax credits and all kinds of reasons for you to put solar on your roof. But what that does is it drops demand in the middle of the day, because if you have solar power on your roof, you're not going to be buying power from the grid anymore, right? You're making it on your roof. So now my demand is going way down during the day when those solar panels are running. So my new load, my new demand line is not the black one, it's now the black plus the dotted. And so if you add all the new wind, all the new solar, and all the new rooftop solar, now, for example, under the CJC bill, we have 17 gigawatts of extra power that we don't need. It's more than we need on the system in that hour. And that means we're shipping a whole bunch of power off the system, which means we have to build a whole bunch new big transmission lines to do that. Very expensive for customers. So this just shows you that it's good to add new clean generation. We can use a lot of this in the summer, but in the spring and the fall and other times when we don't need it, we're going to have a lot of excess. And so we need new technology that can store that energy in the spring and let us use it in the summer, or store it in the fall and let us use it in the winter. That has not been invented. Somebody in your generation is going to need to come up with that. But this just shows you the problem you have with, it's not just let's build a bunch of new wind farms and new solar panels. If we build them and they run at the wrong time, they're not helpful to us. It'd be better if someone could invent a type of clean generation that runs when we want it to run, not just when it feels like running, not just when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, but when it actually is needed. So that's another way to solve this problem, is through innovation, new types of clean generation, not wind and solar, which you have to use them when they're fuel sources available, and otherwise they're not usable. Okay. The other thing we need to do is we need to keep those nuclear plants on the system. They, as you know, are producing most of our clean generation in the state, 90%. And the problem we're having is, this is showing a national map, is that many of these plants are uneconomic. They do not get state subsidies like like wind and solar do, but they don't actually get any benefit from being zero carbon. And so fossil fuel plants outbid them in the market, and they are getting pushed out. So this slide is showing you across the country all the nuclear plants that have closed in recent years. We have 2 that we just announced that will retire next year. Their costs are sort of here. Their costs don't change that much. They've always sort of been here, but power prices have been going down, down, down as the cost of fossil fuels has been going down. And the market price is set by the cost of fossil, and it's not enough for us to cover our costs. So at the same time, we need to be adding a whole bunch of new clean generation. We need to stop this from happening, and those state policies that I mentioned a moment ago, some of them would address that problem. And I'm getting close to the amount of time that I wanted to allot to speaking, so we could save time for questions. And I can make these slides available to you, but the next couple slides explain, in addition to the obvious emissions problem of shutting off nuclear plants, all that means is that you're going to run fossil plants more. You also have higher bills because of the way the supply stack works, and you all are economics folks, you can understand the supply stack if you study it afterwards, and you can understand the emissions implications of shutting down big sources of clean energy. If 4 of our 6 plants shut down, emissions would go up by 45 million metric tons. That's the equivalent of adding about 10 million cars to the state, loss of 28,000 jobs, et cetera. So everything we've been talking about has been state policy, but just looking forward to the election, I thought I'd talk for a moment about what is coming your way for those of you who can vote. The 2 parties have very different approaches to whether the federal government should get involved in setting an emissions reduction target for the country as a whole, and putting policies in place that would help us achieve that emission reduction target. The Biden-Harris ticket has set a goal of a clean power sector, so 0 carbon electricity by 2035. That would be the most aggressive target in the country. Well, the District of Columbia has a sooner target, but no state does. And then have an economy-wide net 0 carbon target by 2050. The Republican ticket does not have they don't have a platform this year, but they certainly don't have an energy platform. And the efforts so far here in Washington during the last 4 years have been to roll back both carbon and clean air standards that the Obama administration had set prior to 2016. And the sense is we should let the market decide this. If people want to buy clean energy, they're free to do that. So let's just talk about that for 1 minute, and then we'll go to questions. I mentioned this a moment ago that there are a number of both utilities that have set targets for themselves. This is voluntary. A utility just says, I am going to make less carbon intensive electricity, kind of like what Exelon did a long time ago, but now some of these other companies are sort of catching up to us and saying they're going to voluntarily reduce emissions from their power plant fleet. On the other side, on the buyer side, you have a lot of big buyers saying, I'm only going to buy clean energy. Some of them, like Google, are saying they want to buy 0 carbon energy to match up with their operations, sort of reflecting that variability. Some people are just saying we're going to buy 100% renewable energy, sort of equivalent to our annual production, not matching it to their actual usage. And then you have companies like us who, if Facebook or Google or somebody wants a contract for clean energy, we can match them up with solar and wind farms and sell them an energy product that will match their operations to renewable energy if that's what they want to buy, or to 0 carbon energy if that's what they want to buy. So that's what I have for you guys, and I'm going to stop with the slides, and happy to take questions.
Yeah, for sure. We had some questions prepared beforehand, so let me see if you can see my screen, right? Okay. So to start things off, and you kind of touched on this in your presentation, but how would the widespread adoption?
All these power plants that make carbon also make conventional pollutants that cause asthma attacks and hospitalizations and higher incidences of COVID. And so the economic cost of the health impacts, in my view, should be counted towards what's the way the economy should go. Obviously, renewable energy is more expensive than fossil fuels. So the question is the cost of fixing the climate crisis less or more than the impacts of the climate crisis? And there have been many studies that show, yes, it will cost more to get carbon out of the economy, but it will be cheaper to do that than to live with the effects of the climate crisis on the economy.
Yeah, and then I guess at what point do you think those benefits might be able to be like incorporated into homes, especially in low-income communities? I know you mentioned like solar power on roofs. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and this, those of you who, well, I spend a lot of my time at the moment in Zoom meetings with a huge group of stakeholders in the state that have been brought together by Governor Pritzker. And he has asked utilities, generators, environmental groups, consumer advocates, faith-based organizations, equity organizations, environmental justice organizations, all of us to come together and to come up with an energy policy for Illinois that will get us closer to our carbon goals, but do it with equity in mind and make sure that the benefits of investing in new clean energy don't just go to traditional players, that they go to BIPOC communities and BIPOC investors. So the benefits of investing in clean energy need to be equitable. The impacts of investing in clean energy need to be equitable. We can't just put new clean energy in wealthy neighborhoods. We have to put it in neighborhoods that are being affected by these fossil plants and having the health consequences of these fossil plants. And we need to shut down those fossil plants that are in either a low-income community or a community of color. Those are the plants that need to shut down first. So the governor's focus here is making sure that as we think about clean energy, we make sure that the benefits of this bill, of this new policy, are being felt equally. And frankly, you know, some of the proposals on the table are to make it unequal in the sense of low-income communities and communities of color should have a better opportunity to participate in the clean energy economy because they have been left out in the past. So they have things like equity point scores. If you want to build a new solar farm, they're going to measure what percentage of your workforce is diverse and how many diverse suppliers and contractors and welders and electricians you have working on your project, and how many investors in your project are from low-income communities or from communities of color. And you are more apt to get a contract from the state to build that plant if you can show that you have met those equity goals. So I want you all to understand this is an enormous focus of your government to make sure that as this policy, you know, as Illinois sort of catches up with the rest of the country and sets a more aggressive emission target, that it is done in a way that's equitable.
Sure. And then you kind of already explained your thoughts on nuclear energy. So I guess, you know, as Illinois and the US continues to move to a zero carbon future, do you think we should be investing more so in nuclear, or I suppose solar and wind?
Yeah, I think it has to be both. It can't be either or. We have an abundance of nuclear energy here. The cost of keeping that nuclear energy running is very low compared to the cost of adding new clean generation. So in my view, the first thing you should do is make sure the nuclear plants continue to run. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So the average price of power on the wholesale market in Illinois is about $20 a megawatt hour. If you build a new wind farm here, you get a $23 federal tax credit. So you get the price of power of 20, plus you get the federal tax credit of 23, plus you get a state rec credit of about $7 or $8, okay? So all in, you're getting 20 from the market, about 30 from the government if you're wind. If you're nuclear, you're just getting the 20. So if we could have not just sort of a renewable standard, but a clean energy standard where all clean resources could participate, the nuclear would participate at, say $7 or $8. The wind would need a little bit more. The solar would need more than that. Rooftop solar is actually the most expensive because you're making just a teeny tiny bit of energy with that equipment relative to the cost of building the panels and installing them. But you should be decarbonizing in a way that uses the cheapest thing first. Nuclear is the cheapest thing, then wind, then solar, then rooftop solar, and you should buy the stuff that's cheapest first, recognizing, however, the point I just made about making sure that sort of all communities can participate in the clean energy economy.
I see. And then, so you also kind of touched on this, but as it stands, how long do you think it might take for the US to entirely shift away from fossil fuels? And how would that be dependent on the results of the election?
Well, taking the second question first, and I talked about this, this needs to happen. We have to have a federal policy, a very stringent federal policy, in my view, and we have to start now because it is going to take a very long time to shift the entire US economy away from fossil fuels. I mean, just think about the cereal, okay? So we have to start as soon as possible, but we are not going to be able to take all fossil fuels out of the economy with the technology that we have. We have to have better sources of clean energy that can run when we need them to run. We need a way to store clean energy, and we need ways to do the rest of the things we do in this economy without fossil fuels. We don't have electric powered airplanes. We don't really have many industrial processes that are run on electricity. Most of you do not have electric cars. I mean, there's almost no electric cars in Illinois. We need to transition passenger vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, buses, trucks. That is going to take a very long time. If we can get the economy to net zero by 2050, I think it's doable, but we have to start right now.
Okay, and I'd now like to open things up for other questions that our members have. I think we've been getting a fair number of questions in the chat. So maybe if you'd like to go through and see what you can answer.
Okay. All right. Even if governments decide to increase renewable and nuclear energy, how can we overcome the roughly 6-year construction period for nuclear plants in addition to all the emissions produced during construction? Yeah, I do not think we're going to build big new nuclear plants in the US. It's not just the 6-year construction, which is actually short. There's a plant under construction in Georgia that has been under construction for way more than 6 years. And there's the cost of construction, there's emissions associated with construction, but when the plants last for 80 years, that's not as big of a deal. But it's the cost and it's the time. So the way the industry is really moving is towards smaller modular reactors that are more accident tolerant. They have a much smaller sort of construction cycle, and they are cheaper. And so there is a small modular reactor that's in licensing at the NRC. It's moving pretty quickly, but my best guess is we're not going to see one of those on the system for at least 5 years. The question is, after that period, how quickly can you ramp up production of these smaller reactors? And that's going to depend on policy. I mean, we're going to need to have a standard that says, which New York has actually. They said 100% clean energy by 2040, 70% of that renewable. So they're saying, the existing renewable technology can't keep the lights on. So we need different forms of clean energy. And so they have a government incentive for that, for those types of construction or innovation, and then obviously construction to come about. But I don't think we're going to be building big new reactors in the US. Let's see. So we have some great questions about new forms of technology that I'm not the world's leading expert on. So I don't want to give you guys bad answers. about things like hydrogen in airplanes. I just have not studied that, and I don't know. Biofuels, there's always the question of where the source of the bio is coming from and the emissions associated with creating it. If the fuel that you're using takes as much energy to create as it takes out in burning, you always have to watch that. But I don't, as I said, there are people who have studied that more than I have. Do you think it's fair for the government to mandate zero carbon energy, considering some people are unable to afford the more expensive forms of energy? For example, California is setting regulations against non-electric cars, which is substantially more expensive for individuals. Yeah, this is an excellent question. And this is what we're getting at with the question of, do we just let the private actors do what they want to do, and people who have money to put solar panels on their roof or buy an electric car have one, and we get where we get, and that's it? Or do we have government make the decision and everyone pays the cost of that? And is that fair? It's not. I mean, it goes back to this question of the national defense. Everybody contributes to the national defense. Now, if you have a higher income, you are contributing more. You are paying more taxes. If you have a lower income, you're contributing less. You're paying no taxes, less taxes or no taxes. Here, when you're using the electric bill, it's not a tax-based thing. And I talked about this. So as professionals, we can design a system that is more fair to low-income residents. We can design a system that says the cost of adding more renewable energy to the grid should be borne more by wealthier accounts than by low-income customers. We can have a system that says, if you apply for a rebate for an electric car, you don't get one if you make $100,000 a year. You only get one if you are a low-income customer, and you get a much bigger one if you're a low-income customer, so that the cost of buying that car ends up being less than the cost of a fossil fuel car. We could design a policy like that. We could say, there's the Nissan Leaf and then the Nissan Sentra. They're like two regular cars. One's electric, one isn't. The electric car is more expensive. If we give you a rebate to buy the electric one because you can show you're low income and you drive that car, guess what? You know how much it costs to power an electric car with electricity? I mean, I bought an electric car last January. My average increase in my electric bill since I bought the car is $18 a month. So that means I'm paying $18 a month to fuel that car. You know how much you pay for gas? I mean, you pay more than that just to fill up your car once, and that's for a whole month. So if you can get lower income individuals into an electric car by using these government policies to give them a rebate, they're going to have a lower cost of fuel. There's almost no maintenance. These cars have 10% of the parts of a fossil car. So they have a lower cost of fuel, they have a lower cost of maintenance. You have improved their economic condition. You have put more money in their pocket because they're not buying gas anymore. So we can use these policies to make it more fair. If we do it and we just say everyone's going to pay the cost of having renewable energy and it's your problem getting an electric car, that would be an inequitable way to do it, but there is a way to do this that takes into account ability to pay.
Yeah, I mean, we have some great questions, but it looks like we're about out of time, so I'd like to start wrapping things up. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and especially thank you to Ms. Barron for spending your Saturday morning speaking with us. And I'd also like, we have two upcoming events, our JEC alumni panel, College Life During a Pandemic, which is Friday, October 3rd at 5:30. And as Ms. Barron mentioned, we have our leading economic development for ComEd and Chicago's electricity event with Melissa Washington, which will kind of be similar, but more on the distribution side to this event. And that will be next Saturday at 10 a.m. We will be sending out a feedback form later, so please fill that out when you receive it. And thank you again for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.